Hello everyone, today I'd like to share with you a very interesting game that was sent to me by one of my students. He is rated 1700 ELO in over-the-board play, in-person games. In fact, this is a game he played in person against an opponent who was also rated 1700 ELO in the context of National for Adult. You might be familiar with this interclub championship. The games are usually played on Sundays, right? He sent me this game for analysis and it's very interesting. There's strategy, there are imbalances in the color complexes, but also attacks on the king. All right, let's take a look. So my student Nicholas starts with the pawn to d4, knight to f6 to control the e4 square, and then c4 is played. The pawn is often played to c4 to block the d5 push, to be able to exchange a wing pawn for a central pawn. Then the idea is to play knight to c3, followed by the e4 push to take control of the center. The opponent plays g6. For now, the opponent isn't too concerned with the center. He wants quick development on the king side with bishop to g7 and kingside castling, knight to c3. And here there are two ways to continue depending on the defense that black wants to play. Players who let the move e4 happen and who play bishop. g7 immediately are heading for a defense called the East Indian where white will play e4. But here the opponent is going to play another move. He will play the move d5, and so he will be in a defense called the Grünfeld. That's the name of the former player who popularized this defense, of course, the Grünfeld Defense. And so this push to d5 ultimately ties back to the idea I explained earlier about exchanging the wing pawn for the center pawn. And so my student exchanges the wing pawn for the center pawn. The knight recaptures, e4 is played, forming the central pawns duo. The knight takes, the pawn recaptures, reinforcing the central d4 pawn. And here you might wonder, what are black doing? Why do black do this? Why do black leave a pawn center like this to their opponent, reinforced by the pawn on c3? The strategy of the Grünfeld is indeed to allow white a pawn center, but in order to attack it, to strike at it. And how are black going to attack this center? They place the bishop on g7 and then look for the c5 push to triple the attacks on the d4 pawn. But you can increase the pressure even more with moves like knight to c6, for example. And when there's a knight on f3 to defend, sometimes the move bishop to g4 can come in to attack and pin the knight. So black's target is the d4 pawn, and lurking in the background, the c3 pawn. In fact, sometimes even the rook on a1. Here, Nicholas plays bishop to c4, and the opponent could immediately push the pawn to c5. Because in case of a capture or a push, the bishop could take on c3 with check. That's actually the usual move, the move c5. But the opponent chooses to make a kingside castling, which is perfectly possible, and will look to play c5 afterwards. And now how should white continue? The best way to continue is to play knight to e2 to prepare for kingside castling. And why knight to e2 rather than knight to f3? It's because if the opponent plays bishop, g4, you can break the pin on the knight with f3, and thus keep the knight protecting the d4 pawn, which will soon be attacked by the c5 push. Whereas with the knight on f3, black can play c5 and then look to play bishop to g4 afterwards. And if white wants to prevent this move, bishop, g4 by h3, then there will be knight to c6. And you can see that white hasn't castled and is already facing 4 attacks on their central pawn. So in the position from the game, as I mentioned, the best way to continue is to play knight to e2, but my student wanted to neutralize the c5 push and decided to play bishop a3, thinking that after the c5 push, he wouldn't recapture with the pawn, but with the bishop. However, the move bishop a3 isn't actually that interesting. Why? Because in reality, can we really stop the c5 push? Can we really prevent it? I don't think so. In fact, black could maybe even play c5 right away. Because if white doesn't recapture with the pawn but with the bishop, it opens the semi-open c file, and there are a lot of weaknesses on that file. Notably the unprotected bishop and the unprotected pawn. Maybe black could play queen to c7 to prepare b6, which attacks the bishop, and then there's pressure on the back rank on f2 and even on the pawn at c3. So the player with black didn't play c5 right away, but played knight to d7, which still supports the c5 push. One could also consider b6, which would also give the bishop the b7 square, and would allow the c-pawn to be pushed to c5. Knight to e2 is played, and here, in my opinion, black makes a mistake. They should have pushed the pawn to c5. Even though it's true that the knight on d7 blocks the queen, and so there's less pressure on d4. But still, I think that's the best move for black. But here, the opponent played knight b6. He attacks the bishop, sure, but the bishop will retreat, and in the end, the knight will no longer be able to support the push to c5. And the bishop that was exposed is no longer exposed. Rook e8 is played to prepare the push to e5, and my student prevents this push with f4. So he wants to neutralize both c5 and e5 to keep his pawn center. But by playing f4, he won't be able to play f3, of course. So bishop g4 is played to pin the knight. Why not exchange it? And in fact, this exchange of the light-squared bishop for the knight will happen in the game and will lead to some very interesting strategies. Kingside castling is played e6, queen to c2 to unpin. And here, the opponent plays bishop takes e2. And this is a critical moment, a very interesting moment. What does this exchange of the bishop for the knight mean? It creates a color imbalance. Once black gives up their light-squared bishop, well, they no longer have the bishop pair. And white will be the only one with the light-squared bishop. That means white will have to fight on the light squares. How will they do that? It's not so easy because the opponent has a pawn structure that protects the king very well on the light square. But we could look for, why not, the pawn push to f5? The d5 push doesn't really interest me since it would open up the diagonal even more for the dark-squared bishop. And besides, the opponent should be looking to play on the dark squares. It's true he doesn't have a light-squared bishop, but he will have a piece more to play on the dark squares because he'll have both the bishop and the knight. Two minor pieces to play on the dark squares against only one for white. If white loses the knight on e2, they'll only have the dark-squared bishop left as a minor piece to fight on the dark squares. So this exchange of bishop for knight will upset the balance of control over the colors. White will have to fight on the light squares to make the most of their only light-squared bishop. And black will have to fight on the dark squares to make the most of their superiority of two minor pieces against one. To play on the dark square. And actually, why am I stopping here? Because when the bishop is exchanged for my knight, you have to decide whether to recapture with the queen or the bishop. It might seem like they're equivalent. And yet one move is much better than the other. A move that won't allow for a better attack on the light squares. Both moves are more or less equivalent when it comes to attacking on the light squares afterwards. But above all, there's one recapture. That could allow the opponent to attack us more effectively on the dark squares. So you need to take your time and choose the recapture that gives the opponent the least opportunity to attack us on the dark squares. Which recapture is it? Should you recapture with the queen or the bishop so that the opponent has less chance to attack us on the dark squares? I invite you to pause the video and take your time to think about it. What did you consider here in this position? Nicholas recaptured with the queen. He wanted to keep the bishop on that diagonal to support the push to f5 and to engage the fight on the light squares. But in reality, you had to recapture with the bishop. Why? Because recapturing with the queen will prevent the queen from controlling the a4 square and will allow the knight to come in, to exploit that square. There will be three ideas for black to be able to play on the dark squares. First idea, as you noticed, it attacks the c3 pawn. Second idea, the knight will be able to support the c5 push. And the third idea is that the knight doesn't just attack the c3 pawn. It's even ready to sacrifice itself, even if that pawn is defended. For example, if the queen comes back to c2 to attack the knight and protect the pawn. c3, thinking that black will have to, for example, retreat their knight. Well, no, they're mistaken. Because the knight could sacrifice itself on the c3 pawn to weaken d4. Because after queen takes c3, the d4 pawn will fall victim to the bishop's attack. The opening of the long dark diagonal, but also the other one, punishes white for that move to f4, which also exposes a weakness on the king along this dark diagonal. And that loses the queen. So after the exchange, bishop takes. If we recapture with the queen, black can exploit that square. A 4 attacking the c3 pawn and even preparing to sacrifice in order to then take revenge on the d4 pawn. And there's always that c5 push that could happen, but it's less interesting than the sacrifice on c3. And if white plays fb4, there may be a5 to dislodge the bishop. Perhaps the best thing for white would be to play fb2. In fact, I think it's the most solid one. And now black, what can they do? Pass c5 right away. Because By playing c5 right away, black also has their weakness on the queen side white square with this unprotected knight and the rook, and we could play bishop b5 the fork. But on the other hand, black could first take the bishop, queen recaptures, and then play c5, attacking that d4 pawn 3 times. And behind there is the bishop, which is unprotected. And this game becomes very interesting. That's why in the position after bishop takes, you have to recapture with the bishop so that the queen controls the a4 square. And that black cannot find the game on the black squares. Knight a4 cannot arrive, c5 neither, e5 neither, because on c5, this time we do bishop takes, there is no problem. And white can calmly prepare the push to f5, the attack on the white squares. But in the game, after bishop takes, Nicolas recaptured with the queen, and his opponent didn't think of the move knight to a4 right away. He didn't think of it because in the post-game analysis, Nicolas told me that they discussed this position, and that knight to a4, he hadn't thought of it right away. Black plays rook to c8, queen to f3 is played, and here black could still play knight to a4, but it might be less effective. Why? Because when the knight comes to a4, it could attack the c3 pawn, but without attacking the queen, since she's no longer on e2. And so white can play bishop to b5. There's no longer a knight takes c3 that attacks the white queen. So this position still isn't clear because here, yes, there's a fork, but there could be knight takes c3 anyway. You still can't recapture with the queen because of bishop takes d4 check. And after bishop takes rook, bishop takes d4 check. For example, king to h1 and queen takes bishop. And this position is unclear. It's true, white is up a rook, but black has compensation for it. So it's still a position with a certain quite significant material balance. In the game, black still hasn't played knight to a4, they played c6. So now they're really threatening knight to a4 because there won't even be this bishop to b5 idea. And Nicolas decides to start the fight with f5 right away. Then pawn takes, then pawn recaptures. He obviously wants to open the f-file to get to f7. And the opponent is considering a sacrifice here. The sacrifice bishop takes d4, check. He does more than just consider it since he actually goes through with it. What do you think of this bishop sacrifice? Takes on d4, check. What is black's objective with this move? You can pause the video if you want to think about it for a bit. So the opponent has to look for play on the dark squares. And for now, what's blocking play on the dark squares? It's the c3 pawn and the d4 pawn, which is the central lock of the position, preventing the bishop from being active on this diagonal, but also on that one. And obviously the pawn that protects d4, the c3 pawn, is also very important. And with bishop takes d4, black's idea is that after pawn takes, they want to recapture with the queen, giving check. And in case of king h1, for example, play rook e3 and create the queen-bishop fork again to win back the bishop. Except Nicolas is going to be a bit more clever. After pawn takes, queen takes with check. Nicolas is not going to move his king, because after rook e3, in the end, it's a triumph for the opponent's sequence. He's actually playing well, the opponent. He has good ideas. Except here, Nicolas plays queen f2, offering a queen exchange, and black can't accept the queen's trade. Otherwise, they'd be left a piece down in the position. So black has to take the bishop, and that's it. The pawn can now capture on g6, attacking f7. Black doesn't have time to take the other bishop because pawn takes already, which is satisfying. But even here, there would be checkmate in 2 moves. Queen takes f7, check, king h8, and queen takes h7, checkmate. So what can black do? They can't take the bishop, and they also can't capture the g6 pawn with their own pawn. Otherwise, queen to f7, check, king to h8. And here it's the triumph of the dark squared bishop for white. They initially had to play on the light squares because they had the light squared bishop and not the opponent. But here is the opposite. They have to play on the dark squares because they have the dark squared bishop and not the opponent. The battle has changed color because the minor pieces have changed through the various exchanges. So Nicolas's opponent here has no choice. He has to recapture on g6 with the queen to protect f7. Nicolas plays rook to d1. And now the opponent plays knight to d5. That seems logical. The knight wasn't doing anything. Now it's back in the game. The knight can look for the e3 square to attack both rooks, but also put pressure on the g2 pawn. So d5 is a good square here, the square d5. And now this is the move of the game. What did Nicolas play here? in your opinion, with white? A little tactical sequence. So I invite you to pause the video once again to try to find the winning move for white. So did you get it? Nicholas played rook d3 here. And that's a very good move. You have to understand the imbalances in the position. The opponent, it's true that he has 2 extra pawns, but there's this imbalance of the dark squared bishop against the knight. A dark squared bishop that can have a very strong diagonal, taking advantage of the weakened king side. Because the g7 pawn is no longer there, so the 2 missing pawns of white are compensated by the lack of safety of the black king. And this bishop along the diagonal can turn out to be more dangerous than the knight. And so when we play rook to d3, we're threatening something. Rook to g3 to take advantage precisely of the king, who is on the file exposed by the absence of the g7 pawn. So once we understand this move, rook d3 threatens to go to g3. So obviously we have to ask ourselves about the capture of the rook, but that diverts the queen from protecting the f7 pawn. We could capture on f7 with check, and after king h8, bishop b2 would be very painful. And for those who saw the move knight to c3, which blocks the bishop, there's still the second attack on the dark squares, queen to f6, which forces king to g8. And then we take the knight with a triple checkmate threat, I believe. Threatening queen to g7 checkmate, queen to h8 checkmate, and queen to f7 checkmate. Black would have to sacrifice their queen to avoid checkmate. For example, queen takes rook in here, you shouldn't recapture. From the king, one last trap, because there would be rook and f8, which would pin the queen, but we can recapture with the queen. And the position is winning for white. Queen plus bishop is stronger than the 2 rooks. And on top of that, you can go back to c4, give a check, play a small move like h3 to take care of the king's safety issues. The position is very strong for white. It's actually completely winning here. So after rook d3, we're not afraid of queen takes because of the capture on f7. And rook g3 is coming. As we said, if king h8, we still play rook g3, then bishop b2. So what did black play? In the game, black played knight f4. And fortunately, by the way, this is a long game and not a blitz or a bullet. On the internet, where you could have pre-moved the move, meaning you anticipate by playing your move first. Because here, if we had pre-moved rook g3 immediately, black could play knight e2 fork, and finally, it's black who comes out well. No, of course, after knight to f4, we're not going to play rook to g3, but instead we'll take the knight. And here, Nicholas's opponent resigned because Nicholas took the knight. There's no defense. The queen still can't take the rook because of queen takes f7, followed by bishop to b2, which will deliver checkmate. You'll need to bring in the queen and the rook, and eventually you'll deliver checkmate. And if the queen doesn't take the rook, white is up a piece and still has this threat. Rook to g3, followed by bishop to b2, a decisive attack in the end against the black king. I found this game very interesting because there were structural imbalances, a center for white that had to be maintained. Then there was a material imbalance with the exchange of the light squared bishop for the knight. Remember, it was here that the bishop took the knight? At that point, white had a strong pawn center. Thanks to this pawn center, white was trying to gain space and prepare a kingside attack to launch an assault against the black king. But this bishop takes knight exchange is going to change the color dynamics of the game. And here, this was the first critical moment, deciding how to recapture. And Nicholas's queen recapture was imperfect, imprecise, because it allows the knight to come to a 4 with this attack on c3, and even possible sacrifices and the possibility to play c5, to weaken d4 and open the dark squared diagonals in favor of the opponent's dark squared bishop. The opponent didn't take advantage of it. In the end, Nicholas ended up launching his attack on the king. But there were still important moments, crucial decisions to make, especially when the opponent sacrificed his bishop for the d4 pawn, if you remember that sequence. It was here. Bishop takes d4, pawn takes queen takes d4. And here you had to think not to play king h1, but to play queen f2. Black can't exchange queens because they'd be left a piece down, so they have to take the bishop. And then comes the capture on g6, where another bishop is offered, but with the threat of checkmate. So black has to recapture with the queen, and now rook to d1, with the idea of rook to d3, without fearing losing the rook because of queen f7, which, thanks to bishop b2, will create checkmate. And with rook d3, we're threatening rook g3 to take advantage of the weakened king's shelter. If you enjoyed this game, you can leave me a like, a comment, share the video, or support the channel. And we'll meet again soon for new adventures on the chessboard. Goodbye, everyone.